Good morning, everybody. So glad to have you guys here today. Today we're going to be looking at wise communication, and I'll pray for us, and then we'll jump into the material here. Lord, you are the one full of knowledge and wisdom. We ask that you would give us both the knowledge and the wisdom this morning, that you would allow my words to come from you, and that all of us listening would receive your words and not mine. Thank you for your word and how you not only have saved us and given us salvation, but take the time to explore such intimate details of our lives and give us guidance. Help us to hear today. In your name, amen. All right. So we're talking about wise communication, and this is what we're going to go through this morning. So first, the 3 principles of communication. We'll walk through each of those, and then we'll go into focused topics. So I'll intro Proverbs for us, give us a rundown of the general book, and then we'll look at 2 specific subjects out of Proverbs, the first one being scoffing, and the second one being praise. And then after that, we'll wrap up, and we'll have some time for discussion. So that's how we're going to do it today. All right. So the first thing is 3 principles of communication. And the first one we have is that there are 2 parts of communication. There's the listening, and there's the speaking. James has a lot to say in the book about communication, if any of you have read it. He goes on and on about various aspects to it. But the most famous verse is probably this. He says, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger." So to start off, we have the listening and the speaking side to communication. And what James is trying to emphasize here in his letter is that quick to listen, that we want to make sure that anytime we're communicating, that we're taking a moment to be really quick to listen to anything people are saying. It can be very easy to, tune it out and be focused on what you're saying. So he's encouraging good listening. He's also trying to encourage careful talking. So sometimes it can be really too quick to talk. We can also not speak. So he's not saying don't speak, which can be something that sometimes people go, I have to be quiet because I seem wise when I'm quiet. It's not what he's saying. You're slow to speak. You're talking, but you may have some filter going on there. I think Proverbs has a good example of this situation. Proverbs 18 says, "A fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing his opinion." This shows that picture of someone who's just stating, oh, this is my opinion, and keeps stating opinion, and really there's nothing coming in, there's nothing they're listening to or understanding. And I know I get this way sometimes, and it's a good reminder to me, oh, wait, I've been saying my opinion for a couple minutes now. I should probably shut that down and move over to listening. So it's really good. But the next thing is probably one of the most important for me, which is principle 2. The heart is the core. The heart is the core. And of course, for this, I love going to Jesus' statements in Luke. So Jesus is talking to the Pharisees and talking about communication, and he says this, "For no good tree bears bad fruit, nor again does a bad tree bear good fruit. For each tree is known by its own fruit. For figs are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor are grapes picked from a bramble bush. A good person out of good treasure of his heart produces good, and an evil person out of his evil treasure produces evil. For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks." So this is kind of the full picture of us communicating. So when we listen, when we actually listen and don't just hear, that sinks into our heart and we consider it. And in this context, in the biblical context, heart is not just the state of emotion, but it's your mental, your memories, your logic. It's kind of your whole being that considers or thinks about or has emotions. So you have to think about all of that. So you would take it in and consider it, the listening side. And then the speaking side, like he says, the abundance of the heart. So you can imagine a pail filling with water, and then it starts spilling out. If you're putting in fresh water, a bunch of fresh water starts to eventually come out. So if you're full of anger, eventually that's going to spill out of the bucket, and you're going to start speaking angrily. But if you're really encouraged and you're excited, or you see something that, oh, that's amazing, that starts to come out of your mouth in praise. So whatever's going in and coming out of your heart eventually comes out of your mouth. And this is important too, because it can detect, oh, I've got a problem with my heart because problems are coming out of my mouth now. So there might be a deeper issue to deal with. So it's good to, as a detector as well. And I think Proverbs has an extra layer to add to this. So in Proverbs 20, it says, the purpose in a man's heart is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out. So we can imagine it kind of like a well. So my heart is definitely an oversimplification of what's going on inside of us. And this kind of shows the concept. So I don't know if any of you have had this where you say something and you think, where did that come from? But that's the concept we're talking about. Just because it's inside of you doesn't mean you know what's inside of you or what your heart has going on inside. I remember I first got married and we were folding socks, and I'm looking at my wife and I'm like, folding the socks wrong. And then my second thought is, why do I care? Where's that coming from? It turns out I have like, oh, we fold socks this way, and this is how it's done. And I have this expectation in my heart that I didn't even know. And so there's just things that can come up that are inside of you that you don't even expect. So that was an easy one that I encountered. I've encountered much harder ones, for sure. So just a reminder that the heart is deep, and sometimes it's helpful to have a counselor or a friend or even a therapist to talk through that has experience that might be able to draw out things that you can't. So just there's a lot kind of in there to work through. All right, and our last principle of communication is building others up. And the verse I love is from Ephesians. So in Ephesians it says, let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. So again, there's two ways you could have the corrupting talk, which they talk a lot about, but what we are focused on is building those up around us. And so I was inspired by Craig's stick figures, so I'm going for that this morning. But really, our focus is to build our neighbor up in whatever we're doing and not tear down. So that's kind of the principle when speaking, to ask, oh, is this building my neighbor up or is it not? Now, something to be aware of is there are times where building them up is praise. Hey, you did a good job, add that brick to the thing. Or encouragement, hey, I would keep doing that because that's coming along nicely. Keep going on that path. But there's also times where a rebuke or a correction is helpful for building up, right? So if you have a runner running a race, you can say, hey, your training's going really well. I see you're like going farther and farther. But if they have a giant coat on or they're carrying a backpack, you're going to say, hey, correction here, I would actually take that coat off because you won't run as far. And so you're trying to help them, but it might be a corrective thing that comes in instead. So when you build people up, there's kind of those corrective and praise directions that are both building. All right, so those are our three principles of communication. We have the listening and speaking of it, and then we have the center, the heart, through which everything kind of travels. And then we have the goal of speaking being building up the person you're talking to. Pause there as we think about that. All right. So now that we have those primary concepts, let's jump into our focused topics here. So we're going to be talking all from the book of Proverbs, where I'm pulling this out of. And I preferred that because the entire Bible is really big, and I didn't have that much time. So it's focusing just on Proverbs. So I'm going to first do an introduction to Proverbs so we get an idea of what this text is, or this book is like. So the first one is the authors. So unlike today's books are usually written in 1 to 5 years, and they're published by a single author, and he tries to make money, and then he writes his next one. So a lot of books are being published, hundreds of pages, and so that's what we're used to. In this time, it's a collection of writings, and this book was written a couple hundred years apart. So the primary person is King Solomon, and it's stated for us in the first verse. This is around 1000 BC. And remember, we didn't have a printing press, so this was probably written on a scroll. There were a couple copies, they copied by hand. So there were only a handful of these, and then we see King Hezekiah found some Proverbs and added them into the collection. And then we see 2 other people in the last 2 chapters added in some additional Proverbs into it as well. So it's really 4 groups of people adding and collecting Proverbs. However, the bulk is Solomon, so that's kind of the main focus and perspective I'll be taking on, since most of the references I have are in those sections. But this is something to keep in mind. And then the audience and purpose, Solomon states his audience multiple times. So he says, "my son," 22 times, mostly in the first 10 chapters. And then he also says, "O sons," 3 times. So the possible audiences here are, it could be one son, possibly Rehoboam, who we know is the next king, and he does rather poorly, if any of you know. The kingdom splits. So Solomon might be just trying to encourage him to listen more and speak more wisely and do wiser things so that his kingdom doesn't split like it did under his reign. He could be talking to a different son or all of his sons, or he could be a little broader and also have wishing anybody to grow in wisdom that's listening to it. So that's kind of the audiences, that potential audiences he's writing to, that this is aimed at. And there's some similarity to us. And the purpose, he states, is to grow in knowledge, the things you know, how things work, wisdom, how to use that knowledge in day-to-day life as you're ruling or as you're interacting with people, and then living rightly before God and man. So at times he tells you how things work, and other times he says, hey, this is the right way to go about it, and this is a very wrong way to go about it. So those are his focuses as he goes through it. And the book is really broken up to first 10 chapters being an encouragement to listen and learn wisdom. And then the rest are individual proverbs that are one sentence each. So they're kind of out of context, which makes it harder to preach on and look at because usually you use the context. So in this teaching, I've really taken all of the individual ones and put them together to gain some context. And we'll look at those here shortly. All right, so I think we've got the understanding of Proverbs, so let's jump into our first subject. So our first subject is scoffing, and this is also, so it's scoff, it also could mean scorn or mock. So those are the 3 words that could be contained in this. So before we look at what it is or anything else, let's first look at the dire state of the scoffer from the Proverbs. So Proverbs 3 says, toward the scorners he is scornful, but to the humble he gives favor. So here we're talking about God himself. Those who are scoffing or mocking, he himself shows contempt for. A very bad state to be. This is very rarely used, that God has contempt for people. So if you are scoffing, God has contempt for you. This is pretty dire. This isn't good. The next one we see is in Proverbs 9. If you are wise for yourself. If you scoff, you alone will bear it. So this starts to take on a form of potential punishment or consequences for your action, and the fact that you are solely responsible for it, and you will do it alone. No one around will be to help you. So it's a very lonely state, the state of a scoffer. And then the last one we see is from Proverbs 24. The devising of folly is sin, and the scoffer is an abomination to mankind. It's just really strong. I was half amused by this because this is actually the last scoffer passage I hit in Proverbs as you're reading through it, and just to hear it so blatantly an abomination to all mankind, it's not looking good. Yeah. So that's our dire state of the scoffer. We have God's kind of contempt toward them, the lonely punishment, and then just the state in respect to mankind. So what is scoffing? Let's look at a couple definitions here. So definition of scoffing is to treat with insolent ridicule, mockery, or contemptuous language. So it's someone that you do not care for, and you're ridiculing them and mocking them, and you have a lot of that language pouring forth towards someone or something. Scorn is extreme contempt, that disdain which springs from a person's opinion of the worthlessness of an object and a consciousness or belief in his own superiority or worth. So again, that concept of the heart we're looking at is your heart has elevated yourself, and you've put yourself, that person, they are lower than me. They don't know what I know. They're below me and deserve extreme contempt. And that's the state you're putting yourself in. And then the last one, mock, this really introduces kind of what you're looking like. So to imitate or mimic in contempt. So this is not just how you speak, but how you're acting, if you're pretending to mimic someone with your motions or how you're talking. So that's another layer to how you could scoff. So we have these kind of couple things inside of this group, which is speak with contempt or imitate with contempt, and then a belief of your own superiority and the other's worthlessness. So that's the scoffing concept there. All right, so before I jump into the next verses, I wanted to put us in a mindset of humility. So when I was going through this, I was like, I'm going to learn about scoffers, I'm going to know how to treat them, and what I came to is, I do this a lot more than I thought I did. And so I'm going to ask the questions basically that hit me the hardest, just to put us in a mindset of taking the log out of our own eye that Jesus taught us before we look at the speck in our brothers. So I want to put us there first. So the things that hit me was, who have I mocked? Is there anyone I've imitated? Who have I spoken of in contempt? And who do I consider myself superior to when I'm talking about them? And then for me, the first one that I thought of was, is there a politician that I've spoken of like this? That's definitely the first one that I go to that I start mocking or scoffing for. And I struggle with that. So I'm like, this is hitting me harder than I thought. Is there a coworker I've talked about with superior contempt? That guy doesn't know anything. He doesn't know what he's doing. I'm doing it again. A neighbor, a relative, a preacher, or is there a fellow Christian? So that's the things I've been working through, and you guys may have some similar spots. You're like, I'm doing that myself. So I want to start there, and then we can look at the next question. I don't want to get you down, just want to get you focused on that. So how do we recognize scoffing in ourselves and others? So let's, again, look at a couple Proverbs with this. Scoffer is the name of the arrogant, haughty man who acts with arrogant pride. So the first thing is arrogance. And that's been clear through most of the stuff we've talked about. And the second one is from Proverbs 1. How long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffing and fools hate knowledge? So the scoffer has, first 2 points are he acts arrogantly and delights in showing contempt. And I know this is common for me. I start to mock or scoff, and I get really excited. I'm like, oh, this feels good. Yeah, to feel superior and yeah, he doesn't know what he's doing. Like, oh. But it feels really good. So these are some indicators that you might be going the wrong way. Proverbs 14 says, a scoffer seeks wisdom in vain, but knowledge is easy for a man of understanding. So the scoffer is pouring out a lot of speech, but like we've talked about before, they're struggling to listen. They're struggling to get inputs. Whereas the wise man is easily understanding anything that's coming in, and he's able to receive those statements. The second one says, a scoffer does not like to be reproved. He will not go to the wise. So not only does he not listen, but he's not going to anybody who might have information for him. So this adds our next two. Unable to find wisdom, again, because you're mostly not listening for it. When I'm scoffing and I'm mocking somebody, I'm not listening for how they might have done that correctly, how I might actually be wrong. I've kind of cast that out of my mind, and I'm focused on this. And the second is, I don't go to find out, hey, what's your thoughts? I'm not asking that question. I just want to keep doing what I'm doing. So those are the two things we see on there. And then the last two or three verses here. A wise son hears his father's instruction, but a scoffer does not listen to rebuke. So at this point, the scoffer's been going for a while, and someone tries to correct him. And again, nothing coming in. So he's not even listening to any corrective feedback, trying to steer him correctly. And in fact, we look at the next Proverbs, Proverbs 9. Whoever corrects a scoffer gets himself abuse, and he who reproves a wicked man incurs injury. Do not reprove a scoffer, or he will hate you. Reprove a wise man, and he will love you. Again, the contrast. The scoffer is not listening, and in fact, his response is not only not listening, but attack. If you say, oh, you're going the wrong way, trying to help him, he's going to attack, and there's going to be hatred coming back at the other person. So here's the things we're looking for specifically to start with ourselves is, are we able to listen to any correction about this? Are our ears open to anything that diverts our path? Or is that not an option? No, I'm definitely right. I definitely know what I'm talking about. And then the second one is, do you start to attack the other person? Are you seeing that? Okay, I've gone way too far. We need to shut this down and start stop talking, start listening, basically. So and then I have that picture there to show you the listening has basically stopped because of the arrogant heart, and then that's pouring out extra speech, scoffing out onto the speech. So, yeah, it's a lot of heavy stuff, and it can be kind of convicting. So I'm going to pause there while I take a drink, because I've been talking a lot. All right. So how do we turn away from scoffing? Right? If this is something we see in ourselves, how do we move away from that? And really, it's really just the opposite of what scoffing is. So the first one is awareness. We've looked through those. Hey, do I see that in myself? Do I have any of those attributes that are coming out? If we see it, then we need to start with the humbling of our heart. Again, the heart's the core. So you can do whatever you want to your speech, but without that heart change, it's going to be very hard to change the speech. So working out to be more humble yourself, and then rehumanizing our opponent. So bringing them up back to an equal level is really important. and being concerned about them. And then the corrective actions is confessing and asking forgiveness. I'd been studying this for a little while, and I was in the car driving home with my wife, and I looked to her and go, I haven't asked for forgiveness because I've scoffed a number of times and I'm now aware of it. So I just looked it over and said, hey, I'm very sorry. I was scoffing for this man and this person, and please forgive me. I've definitely been going the wrong way, and you've been listening to it, and that wasn't right. So like in all things, confessing to each other our sins, and then avoiding other scoffers, not letting that kind of come in. We can just shut that off, and we'll talk about that in a sec as a response. And then turning and becoming a little bit more attentive to correction or rebuke that we may receive, and opinions that may be different from ours. If we're able to consider that, then we're going to be less prone to scoff. So again, just a reversal of the previous things, really. All right, so we've done a lot of probably internal work at this point with ourselves, how we're thinking, and how to correct it. But now let's look at the external. So now that we've looked at ourselves, let's see how do we respond to scoffers? Because it's not only us, there's those around us. How do we deal with this when we see this? So we'll repeat the previous verse we looked at. It says, whoever corrects a scoffer gets himself abuse, and he who reproves a wicked man incurs injury. Do not reprove a scoffer, or he will hate you. Reprove a wise man, and he will love you. So the first thing to note is cautious rebuke. I think the proverb is trying to make a point, so I wouldn't say never rebuke. Indeed, there's probably times where they've rebuked scoffing kings or things like that, where there is a time to rebuke it, but to be aware you might get attack back, hatred. The response is going to be very aggressive potentially. So be more cautious when you approach this individual, and maybe be a little bit more targeted or careful or something like that. So cautious when you take corrective action. The second one comes from Proverbs 22. Drive out a scoffer, and strife will go out, and quarreling and abuse will cease. Now, before we look at the application, I think it interesting that with a scoffer around, he just causes strife and quarreling and abuse. Like, if you look at the center, just notice that the stuff is swirling around him. It's just causing all of these issues. Another verse says, the scoffer sets the city aflame. It's just causing such anger and all this conflict that is just because of how they're speaking. So that's kind of what's coming out. But the first part, drive out a scoffer, gives us some instruction on what to do. So you can either remove the scoffer from the group, or you can leave their presence, right? So removing a scoffer might be a little more difficult, right? So if you're in a big group, that might be a spot for the authority. So maybe you're in a household and it's the parents, or in your church and it's the elders, and they say, hey, we'd like you to step aside for a sec so we can deal with it and not have this going crazy inside here. But you can also leave their presence yourself. Okay, I'm gonna leave. I'm gonna go somewhere else. I don't have to listen. I know this week I was watching YouTube and I saw a video. I'm like, oh, that looks fun. So I clicked on it, and it was 6 minutes of someone just scoffing about someone else's YouTube series. And I was watching it, and I'm like, oh, they did that? Oh, wow, that's ridiculous. And I was starting to just take on the same scoffing and agree with them. And then the next thing I did, I clicked on the YouTube series, and I just sat there, oh, I can't believe they're doing that. That's ridiculous. And I was like, what am I doing? I'm just literally doing what I'm going to teach about. I fell for it again. But the great thing there is, if it's YouTube, I can just turn it off. If it's the TV, if it's the radio, if it's anything like that, you can just turn it off, and it's done. All those issues are gone. So that's a great response we can use. It's just leaving, turning it off. If someone else is doing it, I think I'm going to do something else. See ya. So that's a great response, and it's a much easier response than some of the others. All right, and the last one, there's 2 verses. It says, strike a scoffer, and the simple will learn prudence. Reprove a man of understanding, and he will gain knowledge. So before we go around and start slapping anybody, we'll look at the second passage that's similar, that says, when a scoffer is punished, the simple become wise. When a wise man is instructed, he gains knowledge. So what's going on here is really not individual punishment. We're not going around and slapping anybody. Please don't do that. But this is a punishment level. So this is a much more authoritative spot, government, church leadership, things like that, where someone comes down and says, hey, you've done wrong, you're now under punishment. And so that being doled out is a potential response. And we can see that in this case, the person might learn, the simple becomes wise, could be referring to the scoffer, but it could also refer to those around them. The scoffer may not learn from the punishment, but the people around might be able to learn and grow in their wisdom. So that's our last point here, is the authoritative punishment is another option. Again, if you're not in an authoritative spot, I probably wouldn't take this option. So those are our 3 responses to other scoffers. All right, so I wanted to put this slide up just to summarize it, since we've talked about a lot. But there's the recognizing it, which we have the arrogant contempt, unable to find wisdom, and the rejecting of correction. Then we have the turning away, which is humbling your own heart and rehumanizing our opponent, so we're speaking on an equal level. A note on this, it's okay to say, hey, I think that was a bad decision, or I think that was not the way to go. That's a very different thing than saying, he's an utter fool, I can't believe anybody would ever do that. That's going into the scoffing direction. But it's totally okay to disagree or say, hey, I don't think that was a bad decision because of these things. So disagreement's fine, but there's a line between disagreement and the scoffing area. And then the response is cautious rebuke or just leaving, doing something else, going somewhere else. So, yeah, hope that gives us a good view of scoffing and how to interact with that ourselves and others. All right, so we've worked through a very negative topic. It's probably really heavy. So I wanted to turn from this and go to a different topic, which is praise. So we've learned kind of what to restrict. So now this is something that we want to encourage and do more of. So let's look at the definition. The definition of praise is commendation bestowed on a person for his personal virtues or worthy actions, on meritorious actions themselves, or on anything valuable. So really, when you see anything that is good, it's that noting it, recognizing it, and recognizing the quality of whatever they are doing, or a trait they have. Hey, I noticed you're really kind. That's really great. Different things like that. Proverbs 12 says, a man is commended according to his good sense, but one of twisted mind is despised. And Proverbs 15 says, the tongue of the wise commends knowledge, but the mouth of fools pours out folly. So we have a couple things here. We have another's good sense. When you see someone making good decisions, make sure that comes out of your heart. Sometimes we can just think it, but if you have it inside of you, feel free to pour that out and let that out more. Someone has good insight. Hey, I noticed how you navigated that. Nice job. Or knowledge. Oh, thanks for that. I noticed you really know a lot in this subject, and I appreciate that. It's helping me. I like Philippians 4 when it talks about what to think about. It thinks about things that are true, things that are noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable, excellent and praiseworthy. It says to think about those things. But I think we should also be praising those things when we see them and making sure to pour those out. Now, if anyone has read Proverbs, you're probably familiar with the Proverbs 31 and Proverbs 31 woman that we see and all the stuff she's doing there. And we see at the very end of that passage, it says this: her children rise up and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceitful, and beauty is in vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. And so from this, we kind of look at all the things she did, and this is a good list of things to praise people for. And really, it's the obedience to God's word, and in this context, it was an excellent wife. So an encouragement: husbands, you see something good? Praise it. Wife, you see something good? Praise it. Children, feel free to say, hey, great job, Mom, that looked good. But again, it's things like she was caring for those in her household, supplying food or clothing. Hey, that dinner was really good. Diligent worker, skillful trader. Hey, I noticed you did a lot of work today and you did really good. Like, thanks for doing that. It looked great. Generosity to those in need. Sharing wisdom, teaching kindness, all things she was doing. So again, it's that concept of building others up, just pouring out that speech that builds up anyone you see. Yesterday, I was at a baby shower, and it was really cool, and I was noticing all these different things, and I was trying to, as I noticed, oh, the tablecloth looks really good. I don't usually, pay attention to tablecloths, but this one I noticed. I'm like, oh, hey, who was this? Because it was really good. I'm like, oh, the flowers looked good. The scone was good. Who made the scone? Let me tell you this is good. So if you notice it, feel free to say it. All right, so that's kind of all the stuff about praise. And then I wanted to talk about two spots where it could go poorly and we can go off the wrong way. So the first one is boasting or self-praise. The definition of boast is to brag, to vaunt oneself, to make an ostentatious display in speech of one's own worth, property, or actions. Hey, did you see me do those things? Hey, that was really good. I'm pretty good at this thing up here. Proverbs gives us guidance, saying, let another praise you and not your own mouth, a stranger and not your own lips. So again, allowing others to be the ones that praise you and not bringing it up yourself. Proverbs 30 saying, if you have been foolish, exalting yourself, or if you have been devising evil, put a hand on your mouth. Just a great visual immediately, like throwing a hand over your mouth. Oh, stop, don't do that. Don't do that again. And then the third spot is do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what that day may bring. So let's look at these. First one is self-praise. So we're trying to turn away from anything that would be praising to our own works or actions. The third one is proclaiming your superiority and exalting. And then the fourth one, I got my numbers wrong, but the third one, speaking of certainty about tomorrow, that you somehow can determine the future. Tomorrow, I'm going to make all of these things happen. At work, we have gotten a little used to not doing that because things change enough. So at the beginning of the week, when we have a meeting, we tend to say, well, my plan for the week is to fix this, and my plan for the week is to run 10 of those. We get to the next week, and we're like, yeah, we ran 5. It's not according to plan. But something to be aware of in the speeching and the boasting. So that's the summary for boasting, and you can see that's kind of the pedestal of the heart rather than the building up where your speech is going. As a spot for, like, on an application side, because this can be harder, is a question I get is, how do I apply for a job without boasting, right? Because I'm not supposed to praise myself, so where's the line? So I wanted to give just kind of thoughts that I have on this, and there's probably others in the audience during discussion that could add to this as well. But like, you write your resume, and you're just trying to tell them what you're capable of so they know if they want to hire you or not. So instead of saying things like, I'm basically the best mechanical engineer, I can do all the things, I was the best guy on the last team, instead saying, hey, I can create a small assembly with a motor. I don't tell them I can do a whole instrument, I can't do that, I can just design a motor and a couple parts for me. I can perform at this level. If you need that, then it might be me that you're interested in. And then making your past experience sound better than it is. You know, maybe you were working at a space company and you were designing some bolts for the outside that held some panels on, and you say, hey, I am responsible for getting the rocket into space. And the first thing I'm going to do when I interview you is, so how did you get a rocket into space? You're like 25. Like, I made some bolts, and I made this panel, and like that helps the spaceship get into space. And yeah, it doesn't look really good when you try to boast first and then you get asked about it. So just saying, hey, I made some bolts that had to deal with this and that. Okay, I see what you're capable of. So hopefully that helps a little bit between what's boasting and what is just answering the question they're trying to ask of you. All right, the other side of praise is flattery. So let's take a look at this definition, because this is a little more interesting than boasting. It says, false praise, commendation bestowed for the purpose of gaining favor and influence, or to accomplish some purpose. So notice that the person here is not praising in order to build someone up. They're praising to get something out of it. They're really making a trade. Oh, I can say the positive thing to them, and then they might do something for me in return. Whereas praise is just for the other person. There's no benefit you're trying to get out of it. Let's take a look at the Proverbs here. A man who flatters his neighbor spreads a net for his feet. I think this is just a fantastic image of flattery. As opposed to building the person up, you're spreading a net, and you're like, oh, is he going to take it? Is he going to take it? And if he receives it and he's not paying attention, you catch him and you drag him along with you in whatever you want them to do. I know at work, I had a boss once that, man, he praised me a lot. And I worked for a couple years, and he was praising and praising. And then about the third year, I'm like, something's wrong. Like, I'm feeling like the praise and his opinion of me don't match. What's going on? And I realized he was mostly flattering. He wasn't praising. And when I saw that, later that day, my boss comes and he's like, hey, Andrew, you're a brilliant engineer. And then he pauses, and I'm like, I know this trap. And so instead of saying, oh, thank you, and receiving it, kind of falling into that net, I just ask, okay, what do you want, boss? And he's like, oh, I want you to do these things. And then it allowed me to be like, okay, I recognize you're not actually praising and that you just want something out of me. So I could kind of sidestep the net and be like, all right, what do you want? And let's see how we can make it happen or not. So I didn't get trapped in the same respect. Whoever rebukes a man will afterward find more favor than he who flatters with his tongue. And I think that is a good example. That individual I'm a lot more wary of, and I'm less inclined to listen to because I'm aware of the flattery that he's putting out. And instead, there's others that have said, hey, you've gone the wrong way, I want to correct you. And I could see they're caring about me and building me up, even though it's difficult. Whereas the praise, I'm like, I'm not really trust them. They don't care quite what is good for me. So in this respect, flattering in the end, you don't get as much for as you do the correction. And the last one, a lying tongue hates its victims, and a flattering mouth works ruin. Again, instead of building them up, you're tearing them down and drawing them along, and it just causes more and more problems. So it's a short-term gain for a long-term loss in this. So flattery is really false praise to inflate the ego as the step one, and the step two is goal to gain something in return. And really that's that net that's spread out waiting for you to accept it. All right, so the next question is, how do I detect flattery, right? We're getting praise. Did that guy really mean it or not? What is it? So there's two things that I think might help us. So the first one is the praise seems extravagant, like, oh, you're the best engineer. Okay, like I know a lot of engineers. I know that's not necessarily true. I'm cautious about this guy. And then the praise is followed by a similar request. You're a brilliant engineer. I need your help in engineering. Okay, I see where this is going. I think this is a trade. Yeah, that's kind of the detection. Now, something to be careful with is sometimes we can think ourselves too low and we won't accept praise. So this is a different spot to be in. Some of us accept praise more readily. I deal more with arrogance, so I'm like, oh yeah, thanks for the praise. I think I'm pretty good. But there are times where I'm like, I'm not that good. Like, I don't know why that guy said that. That's clearly not me. They don't know me. So that's something to be aware of. Like, when you receive praise, if they're not, asking for something in return, they're just like, hey, you did a good job, and they leave it at that, that might just be praise. You might actually be as good as they're talking about. So that's a good spot to be listening a little bit more and consider it. It can be a hard thing. And then something to help when you praise people that might be struggling with that and not think they're as good as they are is being more specific. So an example of this is, hey, you made a great dinner. Okay, that's a really general praise. So if the person thought it might be good, they'll be like, oh, thanks, and they'll accept. If they didn't think they did a good job, they might say, yeah, okay, they're just saying that. They're just happy to be eating or something like that. But what you could say is, hey, great dinner. I noticed you made this new sauce. What's that spicy thing in it? That like really elevated it. It's more specific. They can tell you were paying attention to what they did, and so it's more readily accepted by the other person because you've gotten more and more detailed with what you praised. So that's something I've noticed myself, and so I just want to pass that on as a way to praise better and help it be accepted. All right, and I wanted to end with this. I just really enjoy this verse. The crucible is for silver, and the furnace is for gold, and a man is tested by his praise. Now here we're talking about smelting silver and gold. You put it in a furnace and keep taking all of the what impurities of the ore off the top as it's melted until you have just the gold and the silver. And that's kind of what we're talking about with tested by his praise. So someone will listen to how you praise others, how you praise them, and they'll gauge you on it. And this might be from God's perspective or human perspective. The verse isn't clear. But just noting that your praise shows who you are, what you're talking about, what you're thinking about. And you're kind of tested on it, either by God or those around you. It's something to note. So, yeah. All right. We've gone through a ton of material in a short time. I'm going to give us a summary, and then I'm going to open it up for discussion here. So, looking at the first three principles, which happened a long time ago, we have both listening and speaking, and then we have the heart, which is the core that everything passes through. And then we have building others up, and those being the three principles. On our two subjects, scoffing is really speaking with contempt, and we look to kind of avoid those who scoff or mock and to avoid it ourselves. And then personally, we're trying to listen and speak with a humble respect for everyone around us and everyone we hear about. The last one is praise, verbally recognizing good work when we see it, either what they do, their character traits, or the things that they've accomplished. And we're trying to avoid self-praise, which is boasting, and avoid praising for benefit, which is flattery. And on praise, a note I forgot to talk about was I've had times where I struggle with sarcasm, and I would encourage if you struggle with, you go to praise someone, you try to make it funny or sarcastic, try this week not doing that, because it can often lower the praise a bit. And if you just say, hey, you did a good job, like, where was the sarcasm? Nope, you did a good job. I'm trying to just let it flow straight out. That can be helpful in terms of praising people. So, yeah. All right, I'm going to open it up for questions or thoughts on anything new. I think Nevin has the mic in the back, and he'll bring it to you if you have something to say. So, questions too. Yeah, Craig, over here.
Thanks, Andrew. So many good things from Proverbs. I'm curious, you mentioned humanizing the other person as a way to combat scoffing. Do you have any thoughts of ways we can do that, or things that are helpful that way?
Yeah. I think for me, it usually starts in the political realm for me. So when I think about that, I tend to first stop saying negative things for a moment, and then consider whatever they did. And sometimes I'll do the flip. Oh, if somebody else had done that, how would I think about it? So that can help me kind of pull me out of that. I think sometimes finding something good or that's acceptable, I think that's a reasonable thing to do, and think about some of those can be helpful. Again, seeing if something is true, lovely, admirable, you're like, actually that was true, or that specific thing that they did was a good thing, helps to balance and start to bring you out of it. A lot of it's just trying not to view them below you. It's hard, and I think the primary thing for me is to recognize that I don't know everything. So when I look at a politician, I can be like, I know way more than him. I don't read the laws. I don't talk with government officials ever. I start listing out the things I don't know about that job, and it's really big. And that puts me in the spot like, I actually don't know much about being whatever they are. So I think recognizing what you don't know and don't have access to, it helps me. Hopefully that helps. Mark.
Can you help us understand, a lot of this has to do with the heart, right?
Yes.
So how would you share with somebody how the gospel drives this behavior, drives our heart in emotions and our thoughts and our words and our actions? Mm-hmm. How in the context of what you've been talking about would the gospel speak to that?
Yeah, that's great. I think Philippians does a great job kind of giving us the right mindset. So Philippians talks about Christ humbling himself and taking on the form of a servant. And I think really that concept that, I'm here on earth, I'm a human, I can do these certain things, but I have limitations, and recognizing how giant God is and how he is omnipotent. He knows everything in my heart. And he decided to come down and be limited to what I have. the amount of humility that Christ did when he came down was so severe. And starting there, that he came down and he humbled down to that point and then took my sins upon him, is just unfathomable. And so if that's the person I'm following and imitating, and he did all of that distance, just that encourages me and draws me toward, I can be a little bit humbler. I can knock myself down, maybe lower than I actually am, and like be okay with it because he did. So I think that's where you can bring the gospel in and say, like, hey, he went so far down, and I can do a little bit of that too. I could try to do a little bit of humbling myself in these instances. Because as we saw, most of them were exalting ourselves and going the opposite way. So, yeah. Oh. Nevin's getting a good workout back and forth.
Thanks, Nevin. First of all, I just want to say thanks so much for the teaching on scoffing in particular. I mean, it's all been really good, but when I think of scoffing in Scripture, it just sounds so extreme. Like, to be honest, I automatically am like, I'm not a scoffer. That's mean, you know. Yeah. And so I appreciate how you kind of talked about it and the subtle ways that it happens. Having said that, it does seem like I appreciate you trying to, like, we all need to be thinking about it, but it is an extreme category in Scripture. Like, when scoffing's happening, it is like, well, God's response to it, for one, says it's extreme. So how do you balance, like, I guess, I don't really know if I have a question as much as, like, it's good to think about, oh, am I being a scoffer? But the category itself is pretty, like, how we should interact with a scoffer. It does seem like it requires a level of intensity, for lack of a better word. So how do you, I guess maybe relationally, you're like, oh, am I being this, or am I encountering a scoffer? Because I think it could get confusing. If you're always trying to be like, am I doing that? Yeah. To be able to still recognize the extremeness when it's happening to you. Yeah. And kind of the response that takes, I don't know. Yeah. If I'm really explaining what I'm saying well. I got you. Yeah. How to recognize it and deal with it a little bit in the details. Yeah. Day to day. I think for myself, big indicator is that I'm talking a lot and listening a little. So if and again, like, Jesus preaches about your neighbor, and everybody's like, oh, that's the guy next door. And he says, it's anyone you come into contact with. And now that's across TV, across newspaper. And so it's like, am I, that individual I'm seeing or interacting with one-on-one, did I listen to them, or did I just immediately categorize it as, oh, it's them, it's not of any value? So I think if you immediately categorize a person as everything they say is wrong, that's when you're hitting that scoffing and mocking mindset, and that's starting even if you're not saying anything. Obviously there's people who are like, you don't trust them as much. That's totally fine, but just to be wary of when you start to elevate yourself versus others. It's like, do I consider that person a person to talk with, or that I look at? Sometimes you turn them off because they're just acting that way. I think the way to being scoffing, I think is what you're saying, is it's subtle. It happens very subtly. And so that's to be on guard for. Yeah. And yet the like, as it comes to you as a scoffer, like the response versus, like, it's like you can have more of a, I'm just going to turn, like you said, like, I'm just going to turn that off. That's scoffing, you know. Or I'm going to leave this conversation, or, you know, so recognizing it also as well as it comes to you. Yeah. But it starts subtly for us. I think that's helpful. Just talking it out with you has made it more concrete to me, so thank you. I think also in detecting it coming toward you, I feel like some is my response. If I'm getting angry, like I talked about, like anger, quarreling, strife, if that's like building in me pretty quickly, I'm like, whoa, wait. Is this off? And people can say negative things in same different ways. So scoffing you start to like get angry and like things kind of balloon. But someone could be saying it thoughtfully, and you could be like, oh, that's a good point. I'll think about that more. Because I've read things that are negative, but we've noticed these things, we think this is a better direction, and you end it thoughtful and kind of focused rather than mad and ready to like start a fight. So I think that's for me. Yeah. All right. I think that's all the time we have looking at the watch here. So I'll pray for us and end it there. Thanks, guys, for engaging. Lord, you have brought us such wonderful gift in your word. It can hit us at different times in different ways. Ask that you would help us to be looking into our hearts and understanding them a little better through the lens of your word. That it would help us to really draw out like a well the things that we don't want and present it to you. And ask that you would help guide us through the difficulties there with you and with those around us. And at the same time, that we would turn and look for things to praise, that you would build our awareness of the good things around us and the amazingness there and what everyone is doing and what you are doing. Help us this week and going forward to be people who are people of praise, that pour out speech, that praise those around us and build them up. In your name, amen. Thanks, guys.